gospel singer and you spend your life singing about the gospel, you sing about Jesus, you sing about the love of God. That's really what Christmas is.
CeCe Winans has long been regarded as one of the most celebrated figures in gospel music, with a career built on record-breaking success and widespread recognition. Yet, in recent years, her name has surfaced in discussions that go far beyond her music. Political associations and public interpretation have placed her in a very different spotlight. What was once a reputation of pure admiration is now surrounded by debate, and the unfolding situation reveals a story that is far more layered than expected. How CeCe Winans became untouchable. Before any of the recent debates, controversies, or online backlash, CeCe Winans was already operating on a level few artists in gospel music history have ever reached. To understand why every public issue surrounding her now carries such weight, you first have to understand the magnitude of the legacy she built long before the internet began questioning it. Born in 1964 in Detroit, Michigan, CeCe Winans grew up in one of the most influential gospel families in the United States. The Winans name was already deeply rooted in church music and ministry, and CeCe would go on to expand that legacy in ways that would eventually make her a defining figure of the genre itself. Her early breakthrough came in the 1980s, when she stepped into the spotlight alongside her brother BeBe Winans as part of the duo BeBe and CeCe Winans. Their collaboration didn't just perform well, it reshaped expectations for gospel music as a commercial force. Their album achieved double platinum success and became the first gospel project to earn platinum certification, signaling that gospel music could thrive on mainstream charts without losing its spiritual foundation. But that was only the beginning. In 1995, CeCe launched her solo career with the album Alone in His Presence, a project that immediately solidified her identity as more than just part of a duo. The album dominated gospel charts and went on to become one of the earliest million-selling gospel records in history. At that point, it was clear she wasn't just continuing a family tradition, she was building something of her own. As her career expanded into the 2000s and beyond, her consistency became just as defining as her success. Awards began accumulating at a historic pace. 18 Grammy Awards placed her at the very top of female gospel artists, while her influence extended across genres, generations, and global audiences. By the 2020s, her name wasn't just respected, it was institutional. Her reach wasn't limited to awards alone. Her live projects and albums continued breaking streaming records, with Believe For It crossing over 1 billion streams in the United States. Later releases continued to dominate gospel charts, reinforcing that her presence in the industry wasn't fading, it was evolving. Beyond music, CeCe Winans also built a life deeply rooted in ministry. Alongside her husband, she serves as a lead pastor in Brentwood, Tennessee, further strengthening the image of a life fully centered on faith, leadership, and public trust. She also holds stars on both the Hollywood Walk of Fame and the Music City Walk of Fame, symbols of recognition that stretch far beyond the gospel community. By nearly every measurable standard, sales, awards, influence, and longevity, CeCe Winans stands among the most successful gospel artists of all time. And because of that, she also occupies a rare position where public perception becomes extremely sensitive. When someone is seen as a symbol of faith, excellence, and consistency for decades, even the smallest shift in public narrative carries amplified consequences. And that is exactly where the tension begins to build. Not in her music, but in how people interpret her place in a world where faith and public opinion often collide. And as her legacy reached its peak, it also placed her in a position where she could no longer exist outside public scrutiny. That shift is what would later open the door to conversations and controversies that many of her supporters never expected to see, because the first major storm was about to begin. The first major backlash. The first real rupture in CeCe Winans' public image didn't come from her music, her ministry, or anything she directly set out to say. Instead, It came from a moment that was meant to be about public health, but quickly became something far more controversial once context entered the picture. In September 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, CeCe Winans appeared in a government-backed awareness campaign produced under the Department of Health and Human Services. The initiative was part of a broader federal effort to encourage safety measures such as mask wearing and responsible behavior during the crisis. According to reporting from Politico, the campaign was tied to the Trump administration and carried a substantial budget, reaching into the hundreds of millions of dollars, funded through taxpayer resources. On the surface, the message itself was straightforward. Winans had participated in an interview with then U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams, where the focus centered on health precautions and the importance of protecting communities during a rapidly worsening pandemic. The intention, at least publicly stated, was not political messaging, but public interpretation quickly moved in a different direction. Timing became the central issue. The campaign was scheduled to air just days before the 2020 U.S. presidential election. That detail alone shifted the entire conversation. Critics argued that even if the content was about health, the placement and production context made it impossible to separate from political influence. Some political observers and lawmakers questioned whether the campaign was being used to reinforce trust in the administration's pandemic response at a critical moment in the election cycle. And then came CeCe Winans' name being attached to it. Once the ads began circulating, social media reactions erupted almost instantly. Her involvement quickly became a trending topic, especially on Twitter, now known as X. What followed was not a quiet disagreement, but a wave of public reaction that spread across multiple audiences, including many longtime supporters. For some fans, particularly within Black online communities, the reaction was sharp and emotional. Questions were raised about whether she fully understood the political implications of the campaign she had joined. Others went further, accusing her of being used as a trusted cultural voice in a politically sensitive moment. Hashtags and comments referencing political alignment began circulating, intensifying the pressure around her name. Within hours, the conversation shifted from public health messaging to personal scrutiny. Faced with mounting criticism, CeCe Winans released a video statement the same night. In her response, she explained that she had participated in an interview weeks earlier focused on COVID-19 safety measures, particularly mask usage and community protection. She emphasized that the discussion was centered on health, not politics, and expressed concern over the lives being lost during the pandemic. While her response was calm and consistent with her public tone, it did not fully settle the growing debate. Because for critics, the issue was no longer just about what was said. It was about where, when, and under whose administration it was broadcast. In their view, those factors were inseparable from politics, regardless of intent. For supporters, however, it was a misunderstanding amplified by timing and perception. The result was a divide that didn't disappear after a few days. Instead, it lingered quietly in the background of her public image. And although CeCe Winans continued her career, released music, and received major awards in the years that followed, something had subtly shifted in how a portion of the public viewed her. That underlying tension would not stay dormant for long, because years later, a very similar pattern would resurface, this time in a completely different setting, but with the same emotional reaction from the public. And once again, her name would be pulled into the center of a debate she never directly asked to be part of. When history repeated itself, just when it seemed like the earlier controversy had settled into the background of public memory, CeCe Winans found herself drawn back into the same kind of public scrutiny, this time not through an advertisement or interview, but through a simple social media post that many believed carried far more meaning than intended. By late 2025, political tensions surrounding cultural institutions in the United States had once again intensified. The Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C., long regarded as a prestigious and politically neutral stage for artistic excellence, had become a focal point of public debate after it was renamed to include former President Donald Trump's name, alongside its original designation honoring John F. Kennedy. The decision triggered widespread backlash, with critics arguing that the institution was being reshaped into a politically charged symbol rather than a purely artistic one. Several well-known performers even began distancing themselves from the venue, with some publicly boycotting events in protest. What was once viewed as a space above politics had now become another arena, where culture and political identity overlapped in uncomfortable ways. It was within this already sensitive atmosphere that CeCe Winans' name re-entered the conversation. At the time, her younger sister, Debbie Winans, had performed at the Kennedy Center Honors. Following the event, CeCe shared a post on social media expressing pride and joy over her sister's performance. Her message was simple, warm, and familial in nature, praising the production and celebrating her sister's achievement. On the surface, it was the kind of post anyone might make for a family member after a major milestone. But online, context often speaks louder than intention. Almost immediately, reactions began to spread across social platforms, particularly on Threads and X. What might have remained a personal moment quickly transformed into a public debate. Some users revisited her past controversy from 2020, drawing connections between the two incidents and suggesting a pattern in her perceived associations. Others questioned whether her engagement with the Kennedy Center event, even indirectly, signaled political alignment. The conversation escalated rapidly. Criticism ranged from disappointment to outright calls for boycotts, with some commenters framing the situation as inconsistent with the expectations they held for a gospel artist of her stature. Comparisons were even made to historical figures in gospel music who were closely tied to civil rights movements, implying that previous generations of artists would have approached such situations differently. At the same time, there was a strong counter-response. Supporters pointed out that CeCe Winans was not performing at the event, nor was she affiliated with any political decisions surrounding the Kennedy Center. From their perspective, the post was nothing more than a sibling acknowledging another sibling's achievement. They argued that interpreting it as political endorsement was a stretch driven more by online polarization than by intent. Still, the debate lingered. As the discussion grew, another layer emerged: silence. Unlike the 2020 controversy, CeCe Winans did not immediately release a detailed public statement addressing the backlash. That absence itself became part of the conversation, with some interpreting it as restraint and others reading it as avoidance. And so, once again, her name became a point of projection, where different audiences saw different meanings in the same action. What makes this moment more complex is not just the reaction, but the pattern it seems to echo. Two separate incidents, years apart, both involving political undertones, both triggering divided interpretations, and both placing CeCe Winans at the center of a debate she did not directly initiate. And as the conversation around her reputation continues to grow, a larger question begins to surface, one that goes beyond a single post or a single controversy. Because the issue is no longer just about what she did or did not say, it is about what her legacy now represents in a world that no longer allows silence to remain neutral. And that question leads directly into what comes next, where the impact of these repeated controversies begins to reshape how her entire career is being viewed. Between faith, fame, and public perception. CeCe Winans' story, when viewed in full, is not simply about awards, music, or isolated controversies. It is about what happens when a lifetime of achievement becomes larger than the individual behind it. Long before the recent debates and online reactions, she had already secured a place in gospel music history that few could ever approach. But what these recent years reveal is that legacy alone does not protect anyone from reinterpretation. She would not be the first artist in gospel music to find herself at the intersection of faith and public expectation, and she will certainly not be the last. In fact, the history of gospel music in America has always been shaped by that tension. From its earliest roots, gospel has existed not only as a form of worship, but also as a reflection of social conditions, cultural identity, and historical struggle. Many gospel artists throughout history have been drawn, intentionally or not, into broader cultural and political conversations. Some stood visibly within civil rights movements, using their voices as instruments of protest and hope. Others chose a different path, focusing entirely on ministry, music, and personal conviction without direct political alignment. Both approaches carried meaning, and both came with interpretation from the public. What makes CeCe Winans' position unique is not that she is experiencing controversy, but the scale of expectation attached to her name. Over decades, she has built a reputation that extends far beyond music charts. She is viewed not only as a performer, but as a symbol of consistency, spiritual credibility, and artistic discipline. To many, she represents a rare balance between mainstream success and deep-rooted faith-based identity. She is a multi-award-winning artist, a pastor, a mentor, and a public figure whose influence spans both religious and cultural spaces. Her career has often been referenced as an example of how one can remain grounded in faith while achieving global recognition. That symbolic weight, however, comes with a hidden consequence. It creates expectations that are difficult to sustain in a world that constantly demands clarity, positioning, and public alignment. And this is where the tension begins to surface more sharply. Because when someone is no longer seen only as an artist, but also as a representation of values, beliefs, or even political interpretation, every action becomes amplified. A performance is no longer just a performance. A post is no longer just a post. Even silence is no longer neutral. It begins to carry meaning that may or may not reflect the individual's intent. In CeCe Winans' case, this transformation of perception has played a major role in how her recent controversies have unfolded. The reactions she received were not only about the specific events themselves, but also about the expectations people had already placed on her identity. Over time, audiences build internal narratives about public figures, narratives that feel stable until something challenges them. And when that happens, even minor actions can feel significant. Despite this, what remains consistent in CeCe Winans' career is continuity. After the 2020 controversy, she continued recording, performing, and receiving major accolades. Her presence in gospel music remained strong, and her influence did not diminish in measurable terms. Albums continued to chart, awards continued to arrive, and audiences around the world continued to engage with her work. The same pattern appears again in the later controversy. Even with renewed criticism, her standing as one of the most recognized gospel artists of her generation remains intact. The response online may have been loud, but it exists alongside an equally strong base of supporters who continue to view her through the lens of admiration, respect, and spiritual consistency. What becomes clear through all of this is that public legacy is not static. It is constantly being rewritten, not only by the person at the center of it, but also by those who observe it. And in today's digital environment, that process happens faster and more intensely than ever before. CeCe Winans now exists in a space where her identity is interpreted through multiple layers at once: artist, pastor, cultural figure, and symbol. Each layer carries expectations, and each expectation invites interpretation. This is not a position she explicitly asked for, but one that developed naturally over decades of visibility and success. And perhaps that is where the real weight lies, not in any single controversy, but in the ongoing responsibility of being seen as more than oneself. Because when a person becomes a symbol of something larger, faith, integrity, excellence, tradition, the conversation about them is no longer just about facts or events. It becomes about meaning, and meaning is always shaped by perspective, context, and belief. That is why the discussions around CeCe Winans do not simply end with clarification or response. They continue to evolve because they are rooted in something deeper than the incidents themselves. They are rooted in what people expect her to represent. And as long as that expectation exists, the conversation surrounding her will continue to shift, adapt, and reappear in new forms, each time reflecting not only the artist, but also the audience interpreting her story. In the end, CeCe Winans' journey is not defined by a single moment of controversy, nor by a single moment of triumph. It is defined by longevity in a world that rarely allows public figures to remain unchanged in perception. And perhaps that is the most telling part of all. Because through every wave of criticism, every debate, and every attempt to reinterpret her actions, she has continued to do what she has always done: create, perform, and remain present in the work that built her legacy in the first place. And that in itself says something powerful. Not just about the artist she is, but about the enduring complexity of legacy in a world that never stops watching. And in that space between perception and reality, CeCe Winans' story continues, still unfolding, still debated, and still far from finished. And somehow, it remains nothing short of remarkable. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth stories like this. Stay tuned for the next one, and we'll see you in the next video.